Somewhere in your head, a voice is reading this sentence. You did not switch it on. It started the moment your eyes found the words, and it will keep going until you stop looking, and it may now be commenting on the fact that it has been noticed. There it is. That voice feels like the most obvious thing in the world. It is the thing you argue with, the thing that rehearses, the thing that tells you, at unhelpful hours, exactly what you should have said. Now consider a claim that was made seriously by a researcher at one of the world's serious universities and has refused to die for 50 years. 3,000 years ago, nobody had that voice, not fewer people, not quieter versions, nobody. According to this claim, if you walked into a Bronze Age city and asked someone what they were thinking, the question would not have been difficult. It would have been meaningless. There was no interior narrator to consult. When a decision was needed, a voice did arrive, but it did not sound like the self. It sounded like a god. And the person obeyed. If that is true, then the inner voice is not human nature. It is a technology, something invented, roughly around the time of the alphabet, that we are all still running. It is a spectacular idea. So let us find out whether any of it survives contact with the evidence. The theory belongs to Julian Jaynes, who lectured in psychology at Princeton for over 20 years, and it arrived in 1976 in a book with a title that does not exactly beg to be read on a beach. The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Bicameral means two-chambered. Jaynes proposed that the ancient mind was split into two parts that did not experience themselves as one thing. One part issued instructions, the other part received them and acted. Crucially, the receiving part did not recognize the instruction as its own. It heard it. Jaynes argued the command arrived as an actual auditory experience, a voice, with a location and a tone, felt as arriving from outside. And because it plainly was not the person speaking, it was attributed to the only category available, a god, an ancestor, a dead king who had been giving orders in life and, as far as anyone could tell, had not stopped. Jaynes located the source in the brain's right hemisphere, generating language that the left hemisphere then heard, roughly the way you hear someone else. Two chambers, one speaking, one obeying, neither aware they were the same person. And then, he said, it broke. Somewhere between about 1200 and 1000 BC, the arrangement collapsed, the gods went quiet, and human beings were left holding a decision with nobody to tell them what to do about it. What filled that gap was consciousness, the inner narrator, a voice you finally understood to be yourself. 3,000 years ago, which in the history of our species is yesterday afternoon. His central evidence is a pair of poems. The Iliad and the Odyssey are both attributed to Homer, and most scholars agree the Iliad is the older, with a meaningful stretch of time between them. Jaynes read them side by side and argued they describe two different kinds of mind. In the Iliad, the gods do a startling amount of the deciding. Book 1, Achilles, humiliated in front of the whole army, starts drawing his sword on Agamemnon. Athena arrives behind him and seizes him by the hair. Only he can see her. She tells him to stand down, and he does, sword back in the sheath, on the instruction of a goddess nobody else in the room can perceive. Not a metaphor for second thoughts. An event, with a character in it who arrives, grabs and speaks. Where we would expect deliberation, Jaynes found instruction. In the Odyssey, he argued, this changes. Odysseus schemes. He lies elaborately and enjoys it. He conceals his identity, plans several moves ahead, and spends much of the poem doing something recognizable as thinking. Jaynes pointed to a rise in the frequency of the word nous, which he took to mean something close to conscious mind, and to the fact that it increasingly drives the action. The gods are still present, they just no longer have to run everything personally. To Jaynes, this was not two authors with different interests. It was a recording of the changeover. He assembled more. The ancient world is full of statues that appear to have been treated as though they were awake, fed, dressed, spoken to, positioned in rooms built for an audience with them. Tombs were supplied with meals long after the occupant had any obvious use for them. In Mesopotamia, personal gods are described in a way that sounds less like religious belief and more like line management. Your god had opinions about your week. The architecture told him the same story. Enormous effort spent on the seats of dead rulers, cities arranged around a figure who was no longer breathing but was evidently still in charge. To Jaynes, that did not look like memorial. It looked like an administration that had never accepted a resignation. Then, at the end of the Bronze Age, that world falls apart. Cities burn, trade routes fail, populations move, and several writing systems disappear entirely. Jaynes saw a change of tone in the aftermath. Texts start pleading. Where earlier writing issues instructions from the gods, later writing asks where the gods went and why they stopped answering. prayer becomes the literature of someone shouting into a room that used to reply. His explanation is almost elegant. A world running on unquestioned commands works only while everyone receives the same ones. Add refugees, trade, and writing that lets an instruction outlive the mouth that gave it, and the voices start contradicting each other. Such a system cannot survive receiving too. He read the silence that followed as the voices switching off. It is worth being honest about why this theory has kept a following for half a century, because it is not stupidity. The idea does an enormous amount of work in one move. It explains why ancient texts describe gods as audible rather than believed in. It explains prophecy, oracles, and the strange fact that so many foundational religious documents open with someone being spoken to. It explains why hearing voices exists at all, and why it so often carries authority rather than just noise. It even explains the ordinary sense that your own conscience is instructing you from somewhere slightly above. One mechanism, and a great many loose ends tie themselves off, which is exactly what should make you slow down. A theory that absorbs everything you throw at it is not necessarily strong. It may just be loose enough to fit anything. So here is the part most retellings of Jaynes skip. Start with the poems, because that is where the theory is supposed to be strongest. The claim is that Homer lacks the vocabulary of an inner life. He does not. Homer has thymos, a source of motion, passion and agitation. He has nous, associated with ideas, images and perception. He has friends, tangled up with the chest, the breath and the seat of feeling. He has menos, closer to force or life drive. That is not an absence of words for the mind. That is more words for the mind than modern English bothers with. What Homer lacks is our particular way of gathering them into one owner. And a poet who divides the inner life into four moving parts instead of one is not a poet who has no inner life. He is a poet with a different filing system. Worse for the theory is the deliberation problem, because the Iliad is full of people thinking things over. There is a recurring formula for it. A character speaks to his own thymos, literally, talks to himself, weighs two options, and picks one. Odysseus does it. Menelaus does it. Hector does it outside the walls of Troy, deciding whether to run, and he is still doing it when he decides to stand. And here is the part that should have stopped the theory in its tracks. Go back to Achilles and his sword, the scene I just described as pure divine instruction. Read the lines immediately before Athena arrives. Homer tells you exactly what is happening inside him. His heart was divided, whether to draw the blade and kill Agamemnon, or check his anger and restrain himself. He is weighing his options. Alone, before any god turns up. The most famous example of a Homeric hero being commanded by a goddess is also an example of a Homeric hero deliberating. Both are on the page, a few lines apart. Jaynes quoted the divine half. This objection is older than Jaynes. The philologist Bruno Snell had argued decades earlier that Homeric characters possessed no unified sense of a thinking soul, and he took heavy fire for it. The philosopher Bernard Williams answered him directly. Homeric people read perfectly well as whole agents who decide, act, and are held responsible, and finding them alien says more about the theory than about them. Then there is the genre problem. The Iliad is oral poetry, composed for performance, in a tradition with strong conventions about how gods and heroes behave. When a god arrives to redirect a hero, you are looking at a storytelling device with a long pedigree. Reading that as a clinical description of Bronze Age cognition requires assuming poetry works as a transcript. It usually does not. If someone 3,000 years from now recovered our films and concluded that people in this century routinely burst into synchronized song in the street, they would be making the same mistake with better lighting. The philosopher Ned Block raised a harder objection still. His argument is that Jaynes never described the origin of consciousness at all. He described the origin of the concept of consciousness, the point at which people acquired the vocabulary to discuss having an inner life. Sensory awareness, perception, feeling, the capacity to suffer. Block's position is that all of it is basic biological equipment and was never invented by anyone. On his reading, the theory is not merely unproven, it is a category error. And there is a timing problem that is simply very large. Symbolic behavior shows up in the archaeological record long before Jaynes needs it. Engraved ochre at Blombos Cave in South Africa runs to something like 100,000 years ago. Deliberately perforated shell beads are of comparable age. That evidence is sparse, and specialists do argue about how much of it counts as genuinely symbolic rather than decorative, but by 40 to 70,000 years ago, the pattern is unmistakable. Jaynes needs the inner voice to arrive 3,000 years ago. That leaves tens of thousands of years in which humans made ornaments, buried their dead with intent, and coordinated across generations. all while allegedly having no interior narration whatsoever. Not impossible, but it is a great deal of weight to hang on the reading habits of one poem. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Here is where it gets interesting, because Jaynes was wrong in a way that is far more useful than being simply wrong. The inner voice really does have a history. It really is not fixed human hardware. It really is assembled, in part, out of other people. Jaynes just put the assembly in the wrong place, on a timescale nobody can support. The evidence comes from watching it happen, in children, now. Language arrives socially. Before a child has any private verbal life, adults are naming objects, giving instructions, asking questions and explaining what comes next. Then something visible happens. Children begin talking to themselves out loud while working. A child building something will say this one goes here, or warn their own hand. No, not that piece. They are not confused about where the audience is. The speech is doing a job, steering attention and action. And then, gradually, it goes quiet. The out-loud version thins into a mutter, the mutter into a movement of the lips, and eventually into nothing anyone else can detect. The instruction has not disappeared. It has moved inside. Developmental theories call this internalization. And while the exact path is still being studied and does not run identically in everyone, the general shape explains something important. Your private voice contains traces of public life, because that is where it was built, which makes the inner voice a genuine cultural artifact, not invented in 1200 BC, invented in every single childhood out of whatever conversation happened to be available. And that opens the real historical question, the one Jaynes was reaching for and missed. If inner speech is assembled out of the talk surrounding a child, then societies that talk differently should produce inner voices that work differently. Not absent voices, differently furnished ones. That question has actual evidence behind it, just not the evidence people usually cite. Because there is a story that turns up constantly in this conversation, and it is wrong, and it is worth killing carefully. You have likely heard that ancient people could not read silently, that reading was always performed aloud, and that the proof is a passage in Augustine's Confessions where he watches Bishop Ambrose reading with his eyes moving across the page, and his voice completely silent. It is a wonderful anecdote, and it gets used as evidence that the interior life itself is a recent arrival. The scholarship does not support it. That reading of Augustine took hold around the turn of the 20th century and has been dismantled since. In 1968, Bernard Knox showed that ancient sources treat the silent reading of letters and documents as an entirely ordinary event. In 1997, Alexander Gavrilov argued the Augustine passage has been misread outright, that Augustine nowhere calls silent reading novel, and that his actual complaint is obvious once you read the whole passage. He wanted to interrupt the man and ask him things, and could not. That old consensus is now generally regarded as broken. What specialists still argue about is how common silent reading was, not whether ancient people were capable of it. I include this partly because it is interesting and mostly because it is instructive. It is the same shape of error as Jaynes. Take a scrap of ancient text, read it as a clinical report on the interior life, and build a species-wide claim on top. The anecdote is real. The inference is doing more work than the anecdote can carry. If we want to know whether inner experience varies, we should probably ask people who are currently having it. Someone did. The Stanford anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann and her colleagues interviewed 60 adults diagnosed with schizophrenia, 20 in San Mateo, California, 20 in Accra, Ghana, and 20 in Chennai, India. All of them heard voices. The study was published in the British Journal of Psychiatry in 2015. The voices were not the same. In the American sample, the experience was overwhelmingly negative. Participants described intrusion, violence, insult. They described themselves in clinical language, as having a brain disease, a malfunction, something wrong that had happened to them. The voices were an assault by an unwelcome stranger occupying their head. In Chennai and Accra, that was frequently not the pattern. Participants there were markedly more likely to describe rich, ongoing relationships with their voices, to identify them as relatives, as family, as God, and markedly less likely to reach for the language of disease and violation. Not an invasion, a relationship. Be careful with what this does and does not show. It does not mean one group is healthier, or that distress is optional, or that the underlying condition is imaginary. Serious illness is serious in every one of those cities. What the researchers argued is narrower and stranger. that participants outside the United States were more comfortable interpreting the voices as relationships rather than as evidence of a violated mind. The event may be similar. What the culture supplies is the frame, who the voice is, what it wants, and what its arrival says about you. A society that describes the mind as a private sealed room delivers voices that feel like a break-in. A society thick with ancestors delivers voices that feel like family. You inherit the available interpretations the way you inherit an accent, and then apply them to your own head without noticing you had options. Which is the piece Jaynes actually had hold of, underneath all the collapsing Bronze Age cities. So try reversing the question. Ask not whether ancient humans had an inner voice. There is no good reason to think they did not. Ask instead what they thought it was. Because ownership is not automatic, it is an interpretation, and it has to be learned like anything else. A sentence appears in your head unbidden. You did not choose the words before hearing them. Something in you produced it, and something in you received it, and then you performed a small, everyday act of attribution, practiced so many times it has become invisible. That was me. That attribution is the thing with a history. Give a person a world in which minds are private, sealed, and individually owned, and an unbidden sentence is obviously their own thought. Give a person a world densely populated by ancestors and gods with an active interest in their behavior, and the same sentence has an equally obvious explanation, and it is not me. Same event. Different filing. That requires nobody's brain to have been wired differently. No collapse, no lost hemisphere, no species-wide software update in the 12th century BC. Only what we already know. That the mind produces language before you can explain where it came from, and what you call that language depends on what you were taught to call it. Jaynes was probably wrong that ancient humans had no inner voice. He may have been right that they did not consider it theirs, which leaves you with the voice still running. It has not stopped during any of this. It has been agreeing, objecting, getting distracted, and possibly deciding somewhere around the 11-minute mark that it already knew all this. You call it yours. That is not nothing. It is a real claim, and mostly a correct one. And it is also a habit you were trained into by people who are not in the room. 3,000 years ago, the same sentence might have arrived with a different name attached, and the person hearing it would have been just as certain. The voice is old, older than the gods it used to be mistaken for. What is new is that we finally decided to take the credit.